So we will have this available to our membership. Please do stay on mute while presenters are speaking. We're definitely here to share, but please keep all company names confidential. And then at the end, we're going to be collecting the chat information. So we may not get to the Q&As in the chat today, but I found the last time we did a workshop, a lot of people had posted some great ideas as well as some good reference materials. So please feel free to use that. We'll be collecting that at the end and using that for some of our outcomes. Can move to objectives. Next slide. Thank you. So the premise for this workshop comes from the membership, the C45 membership, as well as something we hear from QAs working in the industry all the time. And that is, how do you sample? There is not a lot of guidance in Canada for cannabis sampling. And we know that sampling is being done differently in every company. So there's just a huge amount of variability. So what we've heard from you guys is that you really want to know more about best practices for representative sampling, understand variability in the sample as well as in the lab. We're going to focus on sampling today, and as well understand Health Canada's expectations related to sampling. So, you know, even though there's not a lot of guidance, is Health Canada out there looking for it? So while we don't have all the answers today, we put together a best in practice set of knowledge that's out there, and we're going to present that to you today to see if it resonates. And then if we get enough information and a consensus to do so, we could create a guideline. So even as an industry association, you know, a C45 guideline for our membership on sampling is something that we could conceivably do. We just need to have everybody's input and kind of consensus on that. So that's hopefully the outcome of today. We'll flip to the agenda slide, Brian. Thank you. So we're going to be starting with the presentation portion. So, well, like I said, we've tried to assemble information that is available out there. It's not everything, but we think it's enough foundational information to set up a conversation for today. And then for the workshop session, we'll go into breakout rooms for discussion. So in your workshop, you will have 5 guided questions for the rooms to walk through and chat about. This is where we definitely want to have your voices, so don't be on mute. But you'll have a host in your breakout room to support you with what questions you're talking about and to record answers. And then after that, we'll just be regrouping into where we can do a summary of the feedback that we've received, and we'll move on from there. So I'm going to get into introductions of our organizers and presenters. We can go to the next slide. Great. So these are our presenters today. First, we have Brian. He's a University of Guelph educated and a certified crop advisor with 25 years experience in consulting to farmers on how to grow high quality, high yielding plants. He's been involved in the Ontario agricultural industry, involved with environmental sustainability and improving the Great Lakes watershed through the 4R nutrient stewardship strategy. Brian has worked with A&L Labs since before legalization. It's a 35-year-old analytical testing lab with in-house R&D, soil, water, food, disease, DNA sequencing, and everything cannabis and hemp, including Cannabis 2.0 products. After Brian, we'll hear from Gina Rodriguez. She's a senior consultant with Deloitte and works primarily with licensed clients, helping them navigate regulations and providing operational and quality management guidance. She started working in the cannabis industry in 2013 as a result of her formal training, experience working as a regulator with the federal government, and knowledge and experience of agricultural production systems. We also have Devin Sears joining us from LabStat. He's a senior director of operations, cannabis and natural health products. He joined LabStat in 2018, and prior to joining LabStat, worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 11 years as a senior research scientist. He leads a group performing method development and validation in support of the development of new drug substances in the antiretroviral and oncology therapeutic areas. And we'll also hear from Adam Lai, who's in Deloitte's cannabis practice. His technical background is in engineering and supply chain, and he specializes in manufacturing and warehousing in GMP environments. His project involves continuous improvement, process optimization for the cannabis industry, as well as holistic systems design, facilities design, and quality management systems design. We also had a number of contributors from the regulatory committee, including Qualium Consulting, who supported summarizing some of the jurisdictional information we have today. And a final thank you to Jada Montgomery-Williams from Deloitte, who worked magic on the slides and jurisdictional summaries. So now there's one slide that I get to present, and I'm going to pass it over to Brian. So let's get started with the background. So this is just some additional information on background on why we really care about this and what it matters to our industry in terms of having consistent sampling and representative sampling. So we do know that Health Canada is out there doing sampling inspections as well as other on-site inspections, and they're often looking at our inventories and pulling samples to test. So very important that you know that your test results that you have on record are going to be representative of what Health Canada sees when they do pull that sample. It's pretty common for them to do that, and it's something they can also do remotely. So it's something that should be expected. And you just don't want to have results that are vastly different from what the regulator is seeing in your products. The second item is just recall. So any non-representative result could end up resulting in a recall of your product if it's found that there's issues in the discrepancy, sorry, in the results. And I'd say that it's often a contributing factor to recalls, even if it's not explicitly called out in the recall notices. When companies actually go in to do a proper investigation, they can find areas where sampling didn't catch the problem, and it could have actually prevented that recall. And the final item on here is just the misrepresentation of percent THC in the marketplace. So we know there's a lot of buzz in the market right now about the push for products with greater than 20% THC. Well, you're quite frankly more likely to get greater THC in your product if you're selective about how you pick your sample, but that shouldn't be the case. So it's not the only factor, but it's definitely a contributing factor. And there are companies out there that don't properly sample and maybe misrepresenting percent THC. Maybe it's lack of knowledge, but it could also be purposeful to drive those numbers up. It's something that marketing wants, and it's something that consumers are demanding. So, you know, higher numbers are better in some respects, but if they're not representative of the sample, then it's not a true result, and it could get caught later. So that's some of the background, and now I'm going to pass it over to Brian.
Alrighty, so it's funny how this come about because we're talking about the sampling and the THC and consumers and all that, and I'm like, okay, guys, you know, we can't forget about the plant. We have to continue to educate people. So, you know, my background is in plants, so I just want to talk briefly, and I ask all of you to keep, you know, educating consumers and the industry alike that really everything starts from the plant about the cannabinoids. So many factors that can influence, you know, environmental, nutrients, pH, you know, the light, temperature, water, drainage, all that stuff, the microbiome in the soil. Production methods, as you know, vegetative flower cycle timing, when you flip them, when you top it, the grow area per plant. Like I've been in grows across Canada, and it's just wild the difference of, you know, people's grows. Harvest timing, trichome stage of development, curing, drying, so important. Many of you are, you know, had some previous, you know, work in the tobacco industry, and essentially, as far as the dry flower market, you know, cannabis is no different. Harvest timing, you know, genetic limit of the plant. Like some plants will stretch and they'll push more THC, others won't. So, and then the ID of the plant. So next is some work we did with one of our clients, and we just want to show you. So this is one grow. We took one plant, we took 90 buds off that plant, and we measured the THC. So there was a range of 6.7% THC. You know, the minimum 12, the maximum 18, and the average of 16. So when people, you know, get all excited about the swing in you know, THC levels in a plant, you have to educate them about, you know, the environmental factors. Here's just another visual on that one. Here's another one we did. And basically this one is 5.2% range. So, you know, quite a difference. Minimum 13.5, maximum 19.4, average is 16.2. So We just need to continually talk about that and educate it. I guess in California, it took the consumer 6 to 8 years to get educated on the THC, so they weren't so hard on the growers. So we're 3 years in. I guess we got 3 more to go. So what can be measured can be managed. So, you know, genetics, have they been tested? Are they clean from virus and disease? Because that can affect the cannabinoid output. Environmental, are you measuring the feed and drain water for nutrient levels? Are you measuring nutrient levels in the plant during the grow? You know, there's all the data systems of monitoring HVAC. And in production, are you recording all the cultivation data so you can, you know, analyze it and improvement for each subsequent grow? So I love 7 Acres tagline about respect the plant. You know, I saw this on Twitter. I don't know who I stole it from, but it's a great line. If decisions are made in the boardroom instead of the grow room, you may run into problems growing plants. Cannabis is a plant that happens to produce cannabinoids and terpenes. If you're unable to focus on quality and yield through its life cycle, you probably won't be a successful grower. Start with the basics and improve on every grow. That's it for me. Thank you. Who's up next, Karina?
Mia is up next, and I don't see her in the meeting yet. So I can try to walk through her material. I won't do it as much justice as she would, but let's go through it. So Gina was going to present to you folks the requirements under the Cannabis Act. And there's not a heck of a lot of information in there. So we've pulled out what we do see in the regulations themselves. So here's a couple of points. Samples have to be representative of the lot or batch being tested. That sounds fairly obvious, but there's a lot more to it. And I know Devin is going to be going into more information on sampling and bias. Another point is that the sample has to be retained for at least 1 year after the date of the last sale of that lot or batch. And you have to have enough quantity to conduct your testing again. Very important if you ever have an investigation that you have enough material in there to perform all the tests that might be required for that investigation. It's not in the regs explicitly, but you should also make sure that the storage conditions are such that it's representative of how the product is being stored in the market. Go on to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot to start my video. Samples must also be taken in accordance with the sanitation program. So you need to take measures to make sure that there's no contamination during that sampling process, especially important for something like a micro test or a mold test, and make sure that the person taking the sample is trained on those sanitation programs. The shipping of the samples also needs to ensure the integrity of the sample is maintained. So that can mean if shipping needs to be expedited, or if shipping temperature needs to be controlled for your product, or needs to have a cool pack in there, then you need to make sure that that's done for that sample. Otherwise, again, the sample won't be representative in terms of the results. And then all the processes around sampling, testing, and shipping need to be outlined in an SOP. And of course, we all know SOPs need to be approved by the QA person. So this is a bit trickier for cultivators because they don't have a QAP. And cultivators may be actually doing the sampling and testing for the flower. So if that's the case, the processor that is receiving that product still needs to do something to ensure that the sampling is done according to a representative population. And then the best practice would be to have that also outlined in SOP, make sure the responsible person or master grower approve it. Again, if you are passing that product over to a processor, that processor's QAP would probably want to see that SOP and make sure it's approved. Okay, types of sampling, I'm going to pass it over to Devin.
Okay, thank you, Karina. So yeah, I'd like to start by, going back to Brian's slides there, and we don't have to go back, but just think back to Brian's slides where you saw that very wide range of data points across the plant. And the challenge in sampling is we need to distill that down to one number that's reported on your C of A. And that's the value that's supposed to be representative of the THC value for your entire batch. So sampling becomes really, really important to ensure that we are capturing essentially 95% of the variability within the plant and the batch, and distill it down to that one number. So when we test it once, we get the appropriate THC value. So to do that, there are two types of sampling. There are two buckets of sampling, if you will. One is field sampling and one is product sampling. I'm not going to go into field sampling. This is usually done pre-harvest as an in-process control, just to monitor how the plants are growing and how the crop is doing. I'm going to focus more on product sampling. So this would be post-harvest, the post-trim and drying process. There are two types of sampling that you could do. There's probability sampling, which would be, considered the traditional sampling, the random or systematic sampling. And then there's non-probability sampling, which has the potential for introducing unintended bias and has to be done very carefully. So in the next slide, I'll go into what probability sampling is and what non-probability sampling is. And sometimes you'll hear people refer to these as statistical and non-statistical sampling. They're the same thing. But a non-probability sampling is a non-random sampling practice. And you would use this to flesh out, for example, if you were having temperature gradients in your grow area and you wanted to see how those temperature gradients were impacting your growth, you would be sampling from the different areas within your production facility at different rates. Likewise, you say you have potential bias from different shifts during the trim operation. You may want to sample during the different shifts at different intervals to assess if if there's a training issue with the staff as they're trimming. But more commonly, what you're going to be using is what we call probability sampling. And so probability sampling is really used primarily for the final product. And this is a random sampling practice for the purpose of really taking that funnel, think of it as a funnel, and taking that very, very large quantity of material that's in your batch and trimming it down or funneling it down to say 400 or 500 grams of material that we'll use for testing. And the goal of this funneling down is that 400 or 500 grams should be you should have 95% confidence that that 400 or 500 grams represents the entire batch. And so there's a lot of work that's been borrowed from the pharmaceutical industry around sampling to to put in place standard practices to ensure that we reach that 95% confidence interval. So on the next slide, I kind of have a pictorial representation of the different sampling methods. So for probability sampling, there's what we call a random sampling, a systematic, stratified, and clustered. 90% of the time, a random sampling is sufficient. And that is where, for example, in the upper left-hand corner, if you had a tray, you would sample randomly a number. So here, for example, where we have, say, 20 buds, you would randomly sample 5 of the 20, and you would choose these at random. This is typical for how a lot of sampling operations are done in both the pharmaceutical industry and in the cannabis industry. The next one is the systematic. So here, this is more geared towards production manufacturing. So for example, edibles, if you were producing gummies and you had gummies coming off a line and you were producing, say, here in this case, 20 gummies, you're going to sample at an interval. You establish an interval. So here we'll say 3, and every third gummy coming off the line, you're going to collect as part of your sample. The last two are not as commonly used, and they're used more would say they're probably used more pre-trim and pre-harvest, and that is the stratified and clustered. So stratified would be if you, for example, had two different strains in the same area. It would be a way of mapping the different strains and then ensuring that you're randomly sampling both strains in the area. And then the clustered would be, you would define clusters within your area and sample those clusters. So that's what's being represented in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide, please. So that's kind of an overview of the sampling. One of the things that's vitally important for your operation is to have a sampling plan. And this plan is a document that outlines what sampling technique you're going to use. Are you going to use a random sampling? Are you going to use stratified sampling, and so forth? Then you'll also have the details about the sampling that's going to be conducted. So how many parts of the batch, how much of the material will be sampled for each part, and how many composite samples. So how many are you going to combine into the one sample? And again, here, I'll reiterate, the goal here is to have 95% confidence that the sample you've collected is representative of your entire batch. So the next slide, please. So for random sampling, for random and systematic sampling, the question becomes then how many samples to take. As a rule of thumb, this is not the best rule of thumb, but it's a standard practice. For random sampling, you can do square root of n plus 1. So if you had, for example, 100 trays post-drying, you would sample square root of 100 plus 1. So 11 of those trays you would sample post-harvest. This is not truly a statistical sampling, but it is generally accepted. However, I know in the pharmaceutical industry, there's been a lot of pushback against square root of n plus 1, and the jurisdictional overviews that we'll present later actually have some really detailed tables that give you a map of how many samples to take based on the amount of biomass that you're producing. Systematic, again, you need to define the sampling interval. And so this is really just, how many are you producing? So again, think about that line of gummies that you're producing. How many are you producing? And then how many samples are you going to take from that total? So if you're producing 10,000 and you want to produce, or you want to take 100 sample for your sample size, then you would have a sampling interval and you would collect at every point on that interval. Next slide, please. So now the next piece here is how to sample. So this should also be in your sampling SOP. And this should cover the tools that you're going to use for sampling. It should cover cleaning and sanitization, how you clean the tools, both pre-sampling and post-sampling, and then the sample collection itself. And then also important here is the bagging and labeling. So you should be collecting your sample into a container that is equivalent or as equivalent as possible to your final package material. So if you're packing out into polyethylene bags, then you would want to sample into a polyethylene bag. And it's important that you label your samples at this point as well, according to your SOP. Next sample, please, or next slide, please. And then lastly, there's a documentation component. As with any good practice with GPP or GMP, documentation is critically important. You should have a sampling plan. You should have a sampling SOP. I highly recommend having a sampling checklist that provides all the critical steps pre and post sampling. I can't tell you the number of times in the pharmaceutical industry where we've had active pharmaceuticals sent back to us because we left a scoop in a drum. And we found that just instituting a checklist that says, did you collect all your sampling tools? It really helps to make sure that you're sampling consistently and repeatably every time. Likewise, there should be a cleaning record And finally, a sampling record. So this is the actual record of how much sample was taken and from what part. And lastly, the labels. And in the documentation, I also recommend including a specimen label for what you've labeled your sample. Next slide. So some other things to keep in mind when sampling, some other factors that will influence your sampling and could potentially influence the outcome of the testing. The first is homogeneity. So when you're sampling a plant, for example, it's extremely inhomogeneous. And Brian's data did a really great job of showing how inhomogeneous the THC content can be across the plant. Converse to that, if you're looking at something like an extract, this is a more homogeneous fluid, and therefore you may not need to sample as much of the extract as you would the plant. Rule of thumb, the more inhomogeneous the sample, the more sample that will be required to obtain a representative result. And lastly, I think that it's the last point is actually a little understated, is training. The more that your samplers at your site are trained and recognize the nature of what they're sampling, the better sampling you're going to have and the more representative the result will be when it gets to the lab. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then, yeah, so we touched on the retention. It's a key point here. So like I said, sample into a container that's similar to your final packaged product. You should also store your retention samples in the same. So if you're if your final packaging is a PE bag, you should be packing your retained sample into a PE bag as well. So in conclusion, that all of this combined is really an effort to make sure that the sample that arrives at the lab is truly representative of the batch. And I think the last thing I want to say is that you really need to strive to make sure that the sample you provide the lab is representative of the material that's in your final packaged product. And I think with that, at this point, yeah. So the next thing, the last thing I have here is an overview of what's going to happen at the lab. So every lab should have their own procedures around how they handle samples coming in. For example, I can speak to our procedures. When we receive the sample at the lab, we separate it out. If there's a micro component, we take the micro sample. The rest of it then we homogenize, and we will grind that sample down to a fine powder that has a particle size of a few hundred microns. It's roughly the consistency of matcha tea. And then from that ground sample, we then take our subsamples for the various tests. So I really encourage you to work with your labs and understand how they're taking your sample that you've sampled from your batch and how they're prepping it for their analysis. And then I think that's, yeah. So now I'll hand it over for the jurisdictional examples.
Hey everyone. So just to kind of summarize what Brian, Karina, and Devin has kind of gone over in terms of some of the sampling requirements, I just wanted to kind of go over some of the jurisdictional examples, develop protocols across North America, just to kind of provide some context and examples around the different areas. So here we've highlighted, some areas within the States and within Canada, obviously right now, only hemp has been kind of developed under that under our own framework. So if we can go to the next slide. So we'll start off with Oregon, which is kind of coming out from the Department of Agriculture Lab Services. So in summary, basically to kind of ensure the uniformity and access to the entire batch is required. They've different jurisdictions have set different types of metrics and how they split up the containers or batch sizes requirements in order to drive the different types of incremental samples. So, for example, Oregon, they've required it to be batched out in 15 pounds or less. making sure that it's consistent in terms of the representative samples, using standard sampling methods and equipment. So in this case, what they've highlighted is based on the assigned location numbers within the containers among a set number of containers. You want to collect the sample increments by following different paths throughout the batch container, or by taking the sample increments systematically, making sure that they're well separated points along a certain pattern. And based on the random number generator to determine the locations to sample in order to collect that representative sample across the entire batch. And once you've collected that all the sample increments, then you're able to form a composite sample in order to provide the labs for a uniform testing result. So if we go to the next slide, this is, based on Oregon, the table that they have identified in terms of the metrics and sample size requirements for users to extract those increment samples. So, for example, if because the batch size they've limited to 15 pounds per batch. So, for example, between 1 to 2 pounds of a batch size, you're expected to take 4.5 grams of sample, and at that point, your minimum sample increments is at 7. So you can either increase your number of increments so that your increment per sample is less, but they all have to add up to 4.5 grams. So again, just to kind of reiterate with the sampling method here, is you can use a random sampling method following different paths throughout the container across all containers and the entire batch, or a systematic approach in terms of well-separated points along a, for example, a heptagonal pattern. So that's one example for Oregon. If we go to the next state, we have Colorado. So here, essentially, it's the same type of structure that they have set, but obviously, depending on the jurisdiction, they have set the different types of samples and increments and batch sizing. So with Colorado, they've identified that they wanted stratified sampling, which means you would need to divide your batch into smaller subgroups and then sample randomly and independently. So, for example, if you had a 10-pound batch, which in this case would require a minimum of 15 samples at 0.5 grams, equating to 7.5 grams of total samples, then you can also choose to divide the batch out if it's evenly distributed across the board. So let's say you split it up into thirds. So then the 15 samples are then required to be split into thirds, 5 samples from each third to be taken in order to have that uniformity across the entire batch. You'll see that here some states would provide more guidance in terms of the different types of products. So here, Colorado has identified for the requirements for flour. They've also identified for concentrates and other products. So for concentrates, you would refer to the same table, but in terms of the sample increments, it would be in 0.25 grams rather than 0.5 grams. And in terms of the sampling method, obviously based on the product type, with concentrates, you'll be executing a depth sampling. So imagine having like a thief, and then you'll just be taking the top, middle, bottom after you've kind of mixed it thoroughly in terms of your cannabis product. So we just move right along to the next state. We have Michigan, which again is the same type of metric and measures. Obviously, you'll see that here. There's different types of batch sizing requirements and metrics in order for users to follow. So again, with the flour, they recommended random sampling. You want to make sure that you're collecting sufficient amount of samples in order, not less than 0.5% of the weight of the harvested batch. So in this case, with this state, Michigan, they're saying the maximum harvest batch is 50 pounds. So, and at least 50% of the sample must be homogenized. So in order for the composite sample to be representative. And in this case, they're indicating that half of the composite sample will be untouched for retains if retest needs to be done, and the other half would be for testing. Okay, and if we go to main, the next slide. Again here, same idea, sampling fresh or dried cannabis material, indicating random sampling in a spatial pattern. When in this state for main, they're indicating the batch sizing needs to be separated in metrics of 10 kilos. And if it's more than 10 kilos, you'll just separate it into subsections of 10. And then based on the weight range, the composite sample will need to be in the increments highlighted in table 1 in terms of collecting those increment sample weight. And for just to highlight here as well, so they've indicated for flower, but from a plant perspective, they want you to also divide it into thirds. So then samples will be taken from the lower, middle, and the top portion of the plant. And then continue on to the next slide. Again, we have different types of products, cannabis products. So there's edibles, patches, capsules, shatters, wax, oils, and tinctures. Typically with concentrates, oils, and tinctures, again, all across all the jurisdictions, they would expect you guys to thoroughly mix the containers to ensure that the product flows through from the top to the bottom for uniformity before you perform your sample extraction. And then for edibles and shattered products, typically you would divide it into equal zones and perform your sampling based on the different zones to take beginning, middle, and end. Okay, so if we, again, keep going to the next slide here, the last two examples here are references to hemp. So with hemp sampling, a lot of the jurisdictions have highlighted it, the requirements would be from a field sampling perspective. So you're basically on the field and following a certain pattern, you'll be extracting those samples accordingly based on the flow that they've highlighted. So for example, here with Vermont, with the Agency of Agriculture, the requirements for hemp is that it must be in the flower stage, not more than 28 days before harvest. Healthy flowers cut from the sidearm at least 8 inches in length, and the total samples should be greater than 80 grams of the dry weight basis. And here they've specifically identified that if there's a known number of plants on the field, you want to follow the X pattern, sampling from 7 equal distance points on each path, and making sure that if the number of plants is known, then you can just simply reference table 1 and making sure that it's evenly distributed across the field. And then lastly here, we have Canada as the example for field sampling for hemp. Again, instead of an X pattern here with Canada, they basically said, based on the number of rows that you have on the field, you want to make sure that you're walking crisscross from one end to the next to make sure that you're covering the entire field and making sure you're cutting at least 60 inflorescences at random, normally at the top 1/3 of the plant. So basically, it's going to be 60 clusters of product per sample, and that way you're getting the uniformity across the board. And once you combine the composite sample, you're going to divide that in half as well. One half will be dedicated for testing and the other for retains. So basically to summarize, obviously different jurisdictions would have different types of metrics and requirements based on the distinctions of batch sizing, the different types of patterns. But overall, in general, the recommended method is to make sure that it's random sampling, and you're making sure that there's uniformity across the board with your incremental samples in order to generate that composite sample to be representative of your product.
Great, thank you, Adam. Okay, we are now going to move to the breakout sessions. So what we're going to do is you're going to be split into a room with a host. Obviously, we can start with go on camera, introduce yourself. And then we have a number of questions to walk through. So we have 6 questions here. I'm not going to read them aloud because they will be available for you on screen in the room. And the purpose is to just kind of do a roundtable of, what are you seeing in your facility? What experiences have you had? Please feel free to share as much as you're comfortable doing so. And we're going to be gathering that information live. We'll be taking notes and then reconvening. So we're going to be having the breakouts for about half an hour. So Sasha, let me know when you are ready to throw us into breakout rooms.